I'm going to continue what I began and left in the middle of, or even a third into last time. That is my eulogy for my profession, which I do not believe is going to survive. I spent my time last time talking about how my profession evolved and was created over time. In this country, mainly by an action of the federal government that directed that there be created two new learned disciplines, one called counseling psychology and one called clinical psychology. And it was believed that these two new professions would be much needed in the transition from the hell of World War II to peacetime, with the mustering out of lots of soldiers and having to relocate and find their way into a different future. In the background of what I was saying, I now want to take note of some strains that were already there. First of all, two professions got created. It wasn't a profession of psychology that was created. It was a profession of clinical psychology and a profession of counseling psychology. Already there was a bifurcation in what was to be, what attention was to be paid to what. And like everything else, the grip of the culture, ordinary ways of thinking about things were in great ascendancy. So we wound up with those two names. What were they? Clinical psychology. Those were for people who would be the handmaidens in working with mental health problems, so-called mental health problems. The medical model was very much there. This was some kind of branch of psychiatry. And there needed to be created a set of handmaidens who would work alongside psychiatrists and do some of the things or many of the things, or advise psychiatrists or be helpful to psychiatrists. But the word clinical was attached to that thing to show that it was medically oriented, and obviously it had something to do with the psychiatric profession. By that time in the history of Western culture, long ago, the spiritual healers, the religious healers, other kinds of healers had drifted into the background. And the problem of what to do with disturbed behavior and dissonant behavior had been inherited by the psychiatric profession. So during World War II, there was the assignment of people with little training to help psychiatrists, and now there was going to be the creation of more training. But once again, handmaidens to psychiatry were going to be created, and they would be called clinical psychologists. The other psychologists were counseling psychologists. They weren't dealing with mental health problems. They were dealing with, quote, problems of adjustment. So if people were finding it hard to get back into civilian life, if they were feeling depressed, aimless, if they couldn't feel comfortable relating to their spouses because they hadn't seen them or known them for 3 or 4 years, whatever were the problems of adjustment, counseling psychologists would be trained to be available to facilitate better behavior, better fulfillment, better solving of the problem of readjusting to civilian life. These were considered normative things. They weren't mental health problems. They were just problems in moving from one kind of set of challenges for life into a different set of challenges for life. It had nothing to do with medicine, craziness, or psychiatry. In the departments of psychology that were charged with running these twin tracks, clinical psychology was the glitzy one. That was the one everybody wanted to get into. And the leftovers, who weren't as good promising students, went into the counseling psychology track, because that was nearly not as dramatic or significant or complex. It was for more ordinary people to do ordinary things. Funny, it's making me angry to remember all this. I remember feeling a little envious of some of the courses my fellow students who were in counseling psychology were taking. Many of them seemed interesting to me, but they didn't have time to take courses on my track, and I didn't have time to take courses on their track. By the way, the government was going to support both of those new careers because there would be jobs in the VA carrying those labels and carrying on those functions for people who were moving from military life to civilian life. Now, how the hell did I get involved in this? As I was growing up, I knew absolutely nothing about anything called psychology. It was not a word that came up in any of my coursework in either elementary school, in middle school, nor in high school. Uh, I did know there was something called psychoanalysis because the psychoanalytic profession had made its way into the background of lots of Hollywood movies. And there were some articles in the daily newspaper about what psychoanalysts believe and were doing. And I even had a sister for whom her physician suggested because she was depressed, she ought to go into analysis. So I had a sister when I was in high school who went into psychoanalysis. And that all seemed weird to me. I didn't know exactly what psychoanalysis was. It seemed like some kind of voodoo magic to me as I experienced its consequences in some of the movies that were made during that era. And if somebody had asked me, would you have any interest in becoming a psychoanalyst? I would have said, no, why the hell would I want to become a psychoanalyst? My two passions were either atomic physics or becoming a novelist as I went through high school. I had no desire to take either of those strange forks in the road. The one real brush I had with psychoanalysis, I've talked about this on another lecture, I think, was when I was in high school. And my best friend, Bernie Lewis, said to me, oh my God, I've been reading the most amazing thing. I said, what's that? He says it's a book called The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. I guess he's the founder of psychoanalysis. I said, well, what's good about it? He says it's all full of dirty words. It's incredible, cunnilingus and all kinds of things in there. Oh my God, orgasm. Oh, it's filthy. It's wonderful. You should read it. So I thought this was wonderful, wonderful high class pornography. And I quickly went to the high school library and I said I wanted to check out Freud's interpretation of dreams. And they said, are you over 18? You had to be over 18 to check out Freud's interpretation of dreams. I wasn't, but I had a phony driver's license I had made myself. I had a darkroom then, and I had made myself a phony driver's license because they were black and white and kind of easy to copy and screw around with. So I showed my driver's license that said I was 20. And so I was able to check this out. The school library for uh, Los Angeles High School was across the street on Olympic Boulevard, and it was a branch of the general library that was also the school library for the high school. So I was able to check it out. I had to return it in 48 hours. So I started reading and reading and reading, and it didn't seem that interesting. And yeah, there were dirty words in some places, but I didn't particularly get any kind of thrill. I certainly found nothing I felt like masturbating to reading the book. So I was mildly disappointed. And I thought, gee, my friend must be some kind of oddball if he finds this that compelling and that interesting. But I got the general gist of what Freud was trying to say. He said dreams are not meaningless. That he had put in the book and had interpreted. Now, in the last appendix, hello, did you freeze?
I'll just leave it. Yeah, you froze
Yeah,
for a while.
Okay, I'm going to back up. What was the last thing you remember my saying?
There wasn't very great masturbatory material.
Okay, I went on to say I did, in scanning through it like I did, grasp what the purpose of Freud's writing that book was. He had a belief that dreams are not just random events, that they're quite meaningful, and that most of us carry around conflicts inside of ourselves that we try to exclude from our consciousness. And references to those conflicts seep up in the dream imagery in the night, and that a trained dream interpreter can sometimes help the dreamer find the hidden meanings in his or her dreams. And Freud gives several examples from his own dream life that he incorporated in the text. He then goes on to do something that I thought was a very admirable project. Today, I feel it's a hateful project. The last part of the book is an appendix, and it's called Toward a Scientific, Towards the Science of Psychology. What it is it's an attempt to lay out his ideas and imagery about various parts of the nervous system in the brain and in the spinal cord, certain kinds of loops that exist for various purposes, how those loops are activated by what. And eventually, he says, in the end, all human thinking, experience, and feeling as we experience the world results on the neural networks that are firing in particular ways. And one day we will understand the total array of neurology that underpins and undergirds human consciousness. These were his first steps. He apologized he didn't have enough knowledge to make a complete one-to-one correspondence, that this particular thought is stored here and it's activated by those particular neurons. He wasn't able to do that, but he had every belief that his profession would advance and eventually reach that destination. So I was already in high school without understanding what I was looking at, being exposed to what the philosophers call the reductionist fallacy, that all human consciousness is nothing but the firing of neurons in one sort or another. And that true science consists of finding and being able to articulate what the map is and how the loops and synapses in that map function and stimulate each other. And for reasons that I will get to later, I think that is absolutely absurd. It's causing us great trouble because that's a very commonly shared belief among policymakers, various parts of the medical profession, my own profession, everywhere we go. Those are common sense thoughts about how the equipment of being human is structured. That what is basic is neurological and endocrinological functioning, and all that we experience as human beings is simply froth on those waves. Needless to say, I did not rush into thinking, oh my God, why don't I become a psychoanalyst after I thumbed my way through interpretation of dreams? I marched on through high school, still torn between, was I going to go to, I knew I was going to UCLA. I liked UCLA, it was beautiful. I always thought when I was young, UCLA is Hollywood's vision of what a college campus should look like. And I wanted to go there. I knew it was a good university, and I knew it was the public university. It was very inexpensive. So I was hell-bent on going to UCLA. The only issue was I didn't know whether to declare that my major was going to be literature, my major was going to be atomic science. I was torn. So one day I was talking to my sister about the division in me and my finding it hard to finish. I was soon going to start filling out my applications for admission. And she said, well, I saw something in the newspaper. Why don't you get some vocational counseling? I said, vocational counseling, what's that? And she said, well, there are some experts on helping people understand what their talents are, what their inclinations are, and how to pick a career path based on one's endowment and one's taste and one's aspirations. Those things can be measured fairly scientifically now, and a vocational counselor could help you understand yourself better and maybe see clearer what the possibilities are for you. And I said, well, what do you mean you saw it in the newspaper? That was 1949. She said, well, the article was about the fact that many VA installations were now seeing a large drop off in applications for help for former veterans. It's as if the purposes for which they had been set up was being fulfilled rapidly, and there were fewer and fewer consumers. And the VA had a brilliant idea. It was going to take pity on its staff. It wasn't just going to start making wholesale firings of people. They needed time to think about where they wanted to go and what was to become of them. And it was going to make services available to the public. So for a period of about 1.5 to 2 years, from 1949 to 1951, VA institutions were open for fee-for-service for members of the public who could go to the VA for their health needs, and in this case, for counseling needs. Whatever services were there for the veterans were also now to be there for members of the public who wanted to pay a nominal fee to have them for themselves. So sure enough, I got vocational counseling for a fee of $50. My mother was happy to write the check to the US government, and off I went to the installation at Brentwood and Wilshire here in West Los Angeles. And I walked in from the first day of my appointment. I've told this story before. And I was introduced to Dr. James Bugenthal, who was going to be my vocational counselor. And he welcomed me and he said he would be glad to try to help me. And he said he knew he was leaving. He would probably be around for about 18 more months. I was maybe one of the last people he would work with, and then he would be moving on somewhere else because the VA wouldn't need him anymore. I spent a total of about 24 hours with him. A lot of it was tests that I just administered myself, but he talked to me a lot. He wanted to know, did I have any hobbies? What did I do when I had recreational time? What were the courses in school that were the hardest for me? Which were the ones that I sailed through the easiest? Which ones did I like the best? Did I have any close relationships with any of my teachers because I was particularly bent towards any of them? What did I imagine myself doing 25 years later? What did I think were my biggest shortcomings as a person? What were my biggest strengths? I had a lot of fun talking to him, and I took all kinds of tests. I took the Myers-Briggs. I took vocational interest inventories. I took, the craziest one was the tweezer dexterity test. There were a bunch of little pins in a cup and then a tube. And I had to pick the pins up 3 at a time, and I had to drop them into the tube. And I had to do it as fast as possible. There were spatial relations tests. Oh, of course, there was an IQ test. Interests. There were interest inventories and aptitude inventories of one sort or another. When I was all done, he said he was ready to sit down with me. And he said, I can understand why you would be drawn to both literature and to nuclear physics. You have very strong scientific bent and inclination, and your writing samples that you did are very, very good. You seem to write easily, and you take pleasure from your writing. So I can see how you'd be torn and not want to have to make some kind of decision that would send you in one direction or another. But he said, have you ever considered becoming a psychologist? I said, no, why are you suggesting I become a psychologist? He said, well, it occurred to me as I thought about what psychologists are doing these days, that would provide you a perfect bridge across your river. Psychologists aim and try to become as scientific as possible. They're not nearly as scientific as nuclear physics is, but it is the intent of psychology to increase its capacity as a science, not as a theoretical, only a theoretical discipline. And psychologists do lots of writing. They write books, they write theoretical articles, they write things for the public. Your writing skills could certainly be put to use if you were to continue down the path of becoming a psychologist. And I said, I started thinking. He said, you don't have to decide now. I think the university would allow you, if you are applying for admission, you could apply for a double major. And you could start both paths, sign up as a literature major and as a nuclear physics major and go to school. And there are, if I remember, there are required first year courses on both of those tracks. In physics, there are two math courses you have to take if you're to be a physics major. I forgot, they're theoretical geometry, I think it's called, and then calculus. And on the other track, there is a writing course you have to take, and you have to take at least 3 different kinds of literature during the first year or 2 of your residency. But you still will have time left over for some electives. Even that won't consume you. I suggest as an elective, you just take the introductory psychology class when you set foot on campus and see what you think of it. I said, fine, thank you. That's wonderful advice. I was so happy. I was happy with him. I was happy with the experience. I was perfectly willing to take his advice. There was no big rebellious late adolescent boiling in me. I said, fuck that. That was a waste of time. I'm going to find my own way somehow. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. So I signed up accordingly. And I had cased the joint, and it became very apparent to me that the parking for students was inadequate. If you really wanted to make sure you could get your car on campus, and I was coming from some distance away, you better sign up for an 8 o'clock class, because if you waited until 9 o'clock, the parking lots would all be jammed. So there was one section of introductory psychology being taught at 8 o'clock. I signed up for it, and under instructor it said to be arranged. So I had been smart enough. I knew some people in my friendship network who were a year ahead of me already at UCLA, and I was already picking their brains about various instructors for various courses. But I had nobody I could ask about for that particular offering. So that was at 8 o'clock on Monday morning on my first day at school. I found the parking lot. I looked at the map of where the buildings were. I found my way to the room. I went and sat down, and soon after I sat down, the instructor walked in, and in walked James Bugenthal. He not only had left the VA, he had been hired as an instructor at UCLA. That had become his new job in civilian life. And he was wonderful. I was shy about talking to him. I didn't know if he remembered me, but after the first day of class, he came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm glad you're in my class. We're going to have a nice time together." And we certainly did. And in some ways, he was like the lost father who had died on me and now was reborn. And I kept wanting to answer questions. I kept raising my hand every time there was something to talk about. I wanted to show off for him. I wanted to show him what a good student I could be. I wanted to get the best grade in his class. I came close. I didn't get the best grade though, but I thoroughly loved the class. And that summer, I started in February. I was a February graduate. That summer, I followed his advice too. And every summer I took summer school classes so I could expand the number of courses that I was taking without graduating. And so he was teaching a course called The Psychology of Adjustment, of all things. And I signed up for the summer school class, and I really liked that. In terms of what I'm talking about now, at this time in my life, and have been for years in the classroom, it was kind of an abbreviated course in lifespan developmental psychology. What were the challenges of life that people had to address? what were some of the things that made it difficult in our culture to address them, and how were other cultures different. It was a thoroughly fascinating class. And I was struggling in physics, and I was writing fun. I had good time in my writing classes. But by the end of the summer session, I changed my major. I wanted to be a psychologist. It was very clear to me now. And I never looked back and never regretted having become a psychologist. His best advice for me as I was getting closer to graduation and thinking about where to go to graduate school, he said, well, I'll give you a list of about 6 different graduate schools that I think have good programs. They're quite different, and you need to know about the field. The field is very splintered. There are programs in some of the schools that are being run by psychoanalysts. They're like psychoanalytic training institutes. Some of them are very good. They give very good psychoanalytic training. Carl Rogers has started what is called client-centered psychotherapy at the University of Chicago, and that spread to Ohio State University, where I got my degree. And I happen to think it's a wonderful way of thinking about people, but there are only 2 programs now in the country that are committed to that. And the third one is that the strict behaviorists are teaching how to alter human behavior with principles of conditioning. And there are many schools that teach the problems of how to work with people from a conditioning behaviorist perspective. And there are some of those programs I consider quite scholarly and good. So you may want to think about what is your choice for those 3, because those are your choices. And there's a large number of other programs that are terrible. The faculties have liked getting government money to have graduate programs in clinical and psychology, but the coursework is being taught by them. They don't know what they're teaching because they've never seen a client in all their lives. And they're teaching from textbooks as best they can, and they're teaching clumsily. They have very little firsthand experience, and they're happy to get the paychecks to come, and they're happy to get the extra lab equipment and happy to beef up their libraries. But the quality of education is terrible. I don't want you to go to any of those. And in the end, you'll discover, maybe to your delight, if you do well on the exams you're going to have to take as part of the admissions process and get accepted, do very well on that and have a good GPA by the time you graduate undergraduate. They may be chasing you like football players are chased. You may get a full scholarship ride. You may get housing paid for. You may get teaching assistantship or a research assistantship plugged in, so you have spending money on top of that. In the end, I hope you get accepted to several places so you can juggle what way do you want to be trained and what organized religion you would like to grow up, and who's offering you the best money. And maybe one or the other will predetermine where you're going. Maybe it'll be a combination of those 2 things. So, but I also asked him, what should I take as an upper division? He said, take as few psychology courses as possible. In this school, they're really very boring, and they're usually taught by graduate students and not by the faculty, who has no interest in teaching them. Faculty only wants to do research here. And take the minimum you need to fulfill the requirement for the major. Take a lot of courses in the humanities and anthropology and mythology and in philosophy. And anything on that list is much more worth studying if you want to be a psychologist than the upper division psychology courses are. So I followed his advice. Well, the University of Michigan gave me really a wonderful package. I had done very well on the graduate record exam and on the Miller's analogy test, the 2 tests that were used to screen incoming students. I was in the 95th percentile on both of those, and I was Phi Beta Kappa when I graduated. I had a very good GPA from UCLA, so they offered me a full tuition scholarship, even though I was an out-of-state student. They were waiving all tuition. They offered me a research assistantship, and they offered me a housing allowance. And it was really a nice package. And as a matter of fact, I was fond of saying after I got out of graduate school and opened my practice, I was making more the last 2 years in graduate school than I did when I finally finished the university and left to start being a real worker. Oh, now I'm only going to comment on my graduate education from the perspective of what my lecture is about. I had a very thorough, very scholarly exposure to traditional psychoanalytic thought. The, the faculty was packed with several distinguished faculty members who had been leaders in the psychoanalytic movement in Germany and had fled to the United States in the early 30s and had been picked up by the University of Michigan. It was very much like a psychoanalytic training institution. All we read were books about psychoanalysis and critiques of books about psychoanalysis. We studied the history of psychoanalysis. We studied the psychoanalytic technique. We had other courses, of course. We had to do a dissertation, so we had courses in research methodology and research design and in statistics, but that was a small part of the curriculum. We also had courses in testing because psychologists not only were service providers talking to clients directly, but we were the people who tested clients. We learned IQ testing and we learned personality testing, both objective and projective personality testing as part of the curriculum. I thought the curriculum was thorough. It was well put together. It was well taught. It was taught by people who cared and were zealots about what they were teaching. That part was wonderful. I soon came to appreciate, though, I joined the American Psychological Association as soon as I was still a student, and I started going to the conventions and attending presentations and seminars about things. So I started hearing people who represented the other two points of view that were then boiling in the country and directing training. I began to listen to the behaviorists and hear what was on their mind. I didn't like them. They seemed cold as people. They didn't seem like anybody I'd want to talk to if I had any kind of problem. And I listened to the Rogerians with their wonderful Rogers was a former pastor. There was almost a lovely religious enlightened fervor about their teaching about the importance of client-centered psychotherapy, as they called it, and how much of the benefit of the therapy was actually the unconditional regard of the therapist. It was in the flow between the therapist and the therapy that whatever was healing was transpiring in the encounter. And they would quote things like Martin Buber. I had never read existential philosophy and other existentialists, and that sounded interesting. Didn't seem terribly relevant. All I wanted to know is if you're sitting in the room, what do you say to the client, for Christ's sake? give me sentences to say. I didn't know what sentences I should say. I think that is the dearest thing that young people in training want to know. Well, if the client says this, what am I supposed to say? So I became concerned because I was quite a psychoanalytic zealot. I thought the other things I would hear, I tried to dismiss them as crap. Then it seemed to me like there were three cults. I was in a cult. Every one of the cults had contempt for the members of the other two cults. I was in the cult. I should be a purist. I should stick to what's in the cult. That's what the cult expected of me. I knew the analytic movement itself was strewn with people who had demurred and argued with Freud about some of his principles that got thrown out of the analytic movement. So that is how cults work. And I was ashamed of that part of psychoanalysis. Nevertheless, psychoanalysis still seemed the richest, the most thorough, and the most potentially applicable one of the three disciplines. And I kept my allegiance in place for the longest time. One other thing moved me though, and boy, do I think about it a lot these days. There was what was his name? I think his name was, it was Osgood. His name was Osgood, and he had done a piece of research that we studied in our research design class. It wasn't in any of our professional classes. It was in the research design class. It was an example of interesting design to answer questions about the psychological process. What Osgood had done was to take the three orientations that existed in the field, the psychoanalytic point of view, the behavioral point of view, and the client-centered point of view, and wonder how much they actually influence the behavior of people who had been trained in those points of view. Did we actually take in the training and use it in a kind of pure and dedicated fashion? So he designed the following experiment. He got 20 graduate students who were currently close to finishing their training in a university that was characterized by each of those orientations. So he had 20 oncoming psychoanalytic graduate students, 20 oncoming behavioral graduate students, and 20 oncoming client-centered graduate students. He then asked them to get permission to record a session with a client. To think about a client, we had tape recorders back then, very primitive. They were huge, but we had tape recorders that we could lug around. Get permission, because our newly minted code of ethics required there were recordings to be made, the permission of the person being recorded. Get permission to record them. Think about, take a client you're really proud of. You're doing the work properly and the work is going well. And take somebody you're proud of and really illustrate your commitment to your training, and make a tape recording of that session. And here are some questions we'll give you to answer. They were quite simple. What was troubling the client? What were you trying to do in the session? Questions like that. And then please send it into the research center. So he got 60 recordings sent in, and he had 10 very senior professionals, distinguished senior professors from all three of those universities, 10 of them, representing none of them in particular. He then got 60 more recordings. He got 60 recordings from people who were 20 years out of graduate school already. And many of them had gone pre-war or even during the war. So they had been out in the field and they had been working with clients for 20 years already. And he asked them to identify in what cult were they trained, and to do the same thing, to make a recording of what they thought was a good session and a session that showed devotion to the theoretic orientation, and answer the same questions and send them in. To graduate sessions from the established people in the field, and to pick what was the theoretic orientation of the therapist who did this session. Wasn't how good or bad the session was, but in what theoretic orientation was this trained? Well, the judges could, at about the 90% level of probability, clearly and correctly identify the theoretical orientations of the young people who were finishing their training. They, in their work, they had the imprint of their training on them, and they were emitting it very noticeably in the consulting room. When it came to trying to rate what the theoretic orientation was of the people who had been in the field for at least 20 years, it was chaos. They could, a table of random numbers would have done as well in picking what the theoretic orientation was. So the conclusion of the piece was that whatever training we have doesn't stick to us exactly, and we start wandering away from it as we get older. I'm sorry the article ended that way, because now, in retrospect, I don't believe that's what happens at all. I think that if we're there and if we're present, we soften somehow, following the scripts we've been taught, all of them. And slowly, 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 there are no scripts. We are being influenced by our clients and the pulls they're putting on us, and the material pouring into our ears, and what their hopes and expectations are, and what their movements towards us are, and attitudes towards us are. We are in the sea of interaction with them. And that sea of interaction, plus our own life experience, plus our life experiences with other clients, pulls us into a land none of us have ever visited, and which we are not trained for at all. And I don't know if there is any training for it, as a matter of fact. So I found that article very interesting. I didn't know why I found it so interesting, but it stuck with me. And then my life moved on. I graduated. I joined a group press. They recruited me out of graduate school, and I started becoming one who dispenses services. I tried as hard as I could to stay within my analytic model. Uh, my own little office that they gave me as the newbie was too small to have a couch in it. So I had a big armchair by my desk, and when my client would come, I would turn the armchair so the person faced away from me, and I would sit in my desk chair behind them, and I would have them free associate as if they were analysis, but they were an analysis sitting in a big club chair rather than lying down on a regular chair. I was frustrated. There were a whole bunch of clients, mainly blue collar people, who came for a variety of reasons. They wanted help getting off of alcohol, or they wanted to control their temper with their family. It seemed crazy to me to have them sitting there free associating. It seemed to have nothing to do with whatever distress they were describing to me. I could take some faith in my analytic method if we did this long enough and thorough enough, and we unmasked their childhood traumas and worked them through, and so on and so forth. They would move gradually into better functioning and into a better adaptation to the world. But at the same time, I was feeling stuck and like I'm doing the wrong thing, but I don't know what the right thing is. I was remembering a quote from Freud. He once said that that psychoanalysis would never be a good tool, at least the psychoanalytic method, for working with the general public. He said that for the general public, certain characteristics were necessary to make use of the analytic method. There had to be a higher degree of intelligence than is typically characteristic of the general public. There has to be a psychological mindedness, which is not characteristic of the general public. Young people seem to adapt better to psychoanalysis than older people. And the quote, psychopathology has to be more like eccentricism than really bad psychosis. Freud himself was not sure that the psychoanalytic method was appropriate for psychotic patients. He tried an experiment, and he was unhappy with the results. He wasn't certain he had a definitive answer, but he went back and forth. So he was really saying that his quote was, the pure gold of analysis has to be alloyed with base metals to be dispensable to the general public. So that was weighing on me. I was dissatisfied with the number of people that quit after 2 or 3 visits, and what was I doing or failing to do? What could I have done differently? And then fate moved me along. The Los Angeles Society of Clinical Psychologists had been formed, and my colleagues encouraged the younger members of the staff to join them. Go to a lot of professional meetings, because the truth is, for every one of us, We thought our graduate education was limited in many ways. I thought it was limited because I would have liked to have known more about the content of what was being taught in those other graduate schools. I thought there must be something of value there. Those orientations wouldn't be surviving. So we started to chip in a nice monthly membership fee, and we started bringing speakers in from all over the country to address us on a variety of topics that were of interest. One I suggested and got a very well-known analyst who was very flexible to talk about was how to do analytic-like work with subjects that don't seem fitted for traditional psychoanalysis. So we had a variety of things we were thinking about, hearing about, trying on, and then soon thereafter that, we got into the middle 50s and on into the 50s, 60s, and there was an explosion. The whole culture was flying apart into different things under the stress of the Vietnam War, the women's liberation movement. The culture was in fluidity and flux, and our profession was no different. Many people were experimenting with all kinds of things. We had Arthur Janoff, who I think is a hideous human being, who came up with the belief that the birth trauma coming down the birth canal was the thing that ruined all of us to a greater or lesser degree, and that the most important reparative work. What? Oh,
We're
I'm
going
being,
through the birth canal.
oh, okay. Thank
Okay,
you.
we're-
I thought I had frozen. That was the problem. It wasn't that I had frozen. I was leaking too much. That was the problem. At any rate, Arthur Janoff thought that there had to be an abreaction of the terror and the pain of having come down the birth canal. So he would get people on the floor and he would give them batakas, and they would scream and kick their feet and beat on the pillow with batakas, kind of trying to relive and remember what it was like coming down the birth canal. Fritz Perls was experimenting with what became Gestalt therapy back then. The client-centered movement burgeoned into the humanistic existential movement and gathered hundreds, if not thousands, of followers by the time I'm talking about. And so we were now literally on the Tower of Babel. It wasn't 3 cults we had. We suddenly had 6, 7, 8 different cults, and they were very cultish. Every one of them thought that they had seen the revealed religion of God, and anybody who was not following them was an idiot, was damaging clients, didn't see what the truth was. Oh, the Jungians were founding institutes in Los Angeles too during this period of time. They had gathered strength from their splitting away from Freud. And the Adlerians also were in town in an abundance, and they had split away successfully from Freud. So we had 3 psychoanalytic offshoots, plus a bunch of things being organized and explored by psychologists, and nobody was talking to anybody except with sneers. So that was a very, very difficult time to be alive. And there would be literally very heated fights at meetings about who was doing the right thing and who was doing the wrong thing. My own life got even more difficult and wonderful because I had started participating more and more in the affairs of professional organizations. The building of the profession was very important to me. The fight to get licensure was a very hard and difficult fight. Gee, I think I better start taking notes because I'm not going to get through this. Licensure, okay. I'm following 2 different themes at the same time. One theme is the establishment of the profession as it evolved and is currently established. What are its parameters and what place does it occupy in the culture? Yeah, there are 2 branches on this road. And the other fork, the one I'm more actively engaged in now, is what is the content of the profession? What is it that psychologists understand is what they do and how do they do it? So I'm going to let the formal place in the culture go. That may have to be what happens next week. And I'm going to go on with the content of our profession because it was Looney Tunes back then. As I moved up in the hierarchy and got more and more responsible and challenging positions in the structure of psychology organization, one of the things I did between 1971 and 1978, I was editor of one of the best publications in our field. It was Psychotherapy, Theory, Research, and Practice. And I was responsible for picking what articles got showcased to show to the reading public as the cutting edge of what they needed to know about and where psychology was going. And fortunately, it was the journal was run and owned and operated by APA's Division of Psychotherapy, and the board of directors was composed of wise people like me. We did not want that journal to be captured by any theoretical orientation. It was important. The mission was that the editor was to make sure that what was published was the best in anything that was a reasonable thing to know about. And that was the challenge to the editor. So I got all kinds of manuscripts. I got Gestalt manuscripts. I got behavioral manuscripts. I got Jungian manuscripts. I got all kinds of manuscripts. I was happy to do that. And I had help. I had 20 editorial consultants I asked to help me. Each one knew a lot about something. One of them knew about the coming developments in psychoanalysis, the move from id psychology to ego psychology. Some of them were Jungian, some of them were Gestalt therapists. I had a lot of editorial consultants, and I would send manuscripts to 3 consultants to be evaluated. Reject this. This is not a quality manuscript. This is probably reasonable, but it probably should have some edits. Here's some suggested edits. Send it back to the writer and see if the writer will make the edits. And if the edits are made, I recommend you publish the manuscript to, oh, this one's wonderful. Just publish it as it is. So every one that was to be sent back for reworking or to be published immediately, I made sure I read. I didn't read the ones that 3 people said to reject. I just rejected them. I had too many manuscripts. I was getting a few hundred a year, and I was spending very significant time just reading manuscripts as it was. But God damn it, those manuscripts forced me more open too, because I was feeling, my colleagues were right. I was finding goodness in them, even though we're talking about concepts, the words of which I had never used before, even thought of, or I wasn't even sure I understood what I was reading fully. But I knew we were giving birth to many, many things that maybe could be woven together and into something unifying, but the fragments of it certainly were worth knowing about. And so I was pleased with what got published under my aegis for those 7 years. And it changed me forever. It blew away any last belief that I was going to practice as close as I could to ordinary historical theoretical psychoanalysis. I no longer identified myself as a psychoanalytically oriented clinical psychologist. No, thank you. That wasn't me anymore. I didn't know what I was, but I wasn't that anymore. I didn't have a label to describe myself. Oh, by the way, if you called yourself an eclectic, meaning you pick things from here, there, and everywhere else, the members of the cult would truly sneer at you. You are a coward if you're calling yourself an eclectic. What's the matter with you? Stand up and take a look and clear your eyes, and you'll understand that X is the correct way to think about things. That's chicken shit to say you're eclectic. God almighty. All right. I still have a few minutes left. I think it wasn't only my reading that was doing things to me. Uh, I think unless we're very rigid and strange, all of us are on the road of life. And for those of us who are psychologists, some of the important experiences we have are interacting with what's happening in our field and the experiences we're having, because every day we're called into a kind of communion and intimacy with many other human lives. We are probably about the most social of almost any career. Our life consists of interacting during many of our waking hours with other humans. In addition, we move along the paths of our personal lives. Deaths happen, illnesses happen, various kind of life experiences fall in our lap. Some of us have children and have to learn how to raise children. We're also being challenged and massaged and pulled at by the events that are taking place as we walk forward on the road of our own life. I don't think any of us can remain static. The life experiences we have, the interactions with our clients, the things we try and learn about, and what's happening in the culture around us keeps altering who the fuck we are. And for us to hold on to a set of principles and to keep implementing them in the consulting room day after day, year after year, unquestioned, unchanging, I think is insane. That couldn't possibly happen except if it was a programmed robot who was then put into the consulting room on a date and would just interact with those rituals inside, playing over and over and over again until the robot got rusty and broke. We are not robots. We are constantly evolving. We are constantly transforming itself. So I could go down the rest of this road, I think, before I stop today. I have arrived at a belief that I have no treatment plan. I have none. I have a treatment plan to show up. That's my treatment plan. I will see the following clients at the following times I've reserved for them. So some of them are going to break their appointments and not show up, but that is my treatment plan. It's my attempt to show up. I used to have a plan, and I think we are taught by the end of the session, we're supposed to have some thoughts about what needs to be taken up next. And we are supposed to start orienting ourselves to the possibility of what the conversation should be or ought to be or is going to be at the very next visit. I threw that one away too a few decades ago. I don't have any plan for what the conversation is going to be with a client when a client shows up. We sit down, I wait, the client starts talking, or the client sits there silently. If the client sits there silently, I start talking about something. I gave a talk to the Los Angeles County Psychological Association. I think it was 4 years ago on the use of intuition in psychotherapy. And I firmly believe in that. I trust what's in my preconscious. I sit down, I look at the other person. If words are coming at me, I trust what's rising in response to those words, imagery of kinds, memories of kinds, things I might say that I think are being pulled by the words might come to me. I just trust riding that wave and I take it wherever it takes me for the rest of the session until the session is over. And then I'm done. Sometimes I have some reflections afterward. Oh, I missed something. He said that. Oh, wouldn't it have been nice if I said that? So I store something away that I think of in retrospect. Most of the time, I don't think of the session at all. It comes to closure and it's gone because I'm busy with the next one. More likely to think of something in the last session of the day because I don't have a replacement about to take its place. So I don't decide. I'm not healing. We'll talk about that because that's part of the other. I'm not healing anybody. I'm not curing anybody. I'm not treating anybody. I'm having a human relationship with somebody. It's probably a very different human relationship than anybody else has with them. And I'm simply allowing the human relationship to grow and unfold and get tended to by both of us and go wherever it needs to go as a result of the interactions between the two of us. I don't tell people not to quit. I don't tell them to say. I don't tell them to leave. That's all in their hands. I just show up when they want me to show up, and I interact with them in terms of what rises in me to pay attention to as I'm interacting with them. And I think on that note, I will stop here. And I will have one more lecture about the formal parts of how the profession is put together. All comments are gratefully received.
I have a couple comments, Arthur. I really liked your mentor, James Bugenthal.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I've heard his name before. I'm not sure where, but
Oh, he became one of the giants in the humanistic existential movement.
yeah, but
He wrote that wonderful book towards the psychology of being.
yes, right. But yeah, he seems like he was extremely important to you and in your, development and your formation of what you wanted to do. I had a similar mentor at the University of Michigan as well, in my undergraduate, who sort of like took me on, and then I did some research in his office, and he connected me with his with a children's psychiatric hospital, and just was very influential in terms of like my budding career.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I also I too in my practice, it's like it's just like the most valuable thing that I can provide is my intuition. Sometimes I think of it as an unconscious, and in terms of like what it is that I'm experiencing, from that client, and then putting it out there and feeding it back to them. And it usually proves to be so kind of like valuable, and it's almost like uncanny.
That's because there's too few moments when any of us feels heard and understood and cared about. That thing you're describing provides all three. The client is heard, the client is cared about, and sometimes you can provide something that's helpful too.
Yeah, I think Rogers called that meeting the person with your own quivering humanness,
Yes.
and being there in that moment. Yeah, I believe in that self-righting nature of people, that if you provide that environment, like any boat with a good keel, they will just slowly start to become who they were meant to be, and where them get back on course if you kind of give them a kind of a safe harbor, if you will. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. And I want to tell you, one of the things that saddened me the most, Carl Rogers was very good about writing about the noble nature of the work that we should always aspire to do. And I want to say personally, he was very bad at doing that. He was quite shy. He was quite wooden. He was quite cautious. He was not at all a warm and accessible human being.
Yeah. There are stories. I went to Cal State Long Beach for my BA, and when it was started, they started the psychology program, I think in the 50s, and they invited him to come. And when I was there, professors who had met him and were at this big meeting, he was going to consult on how to start this brand new program, and they wanted to make it this humanistic. And he sat down, and everybody was looking at him, and he said, "So what do you want to do?" He made it very client-centered. I think that's pretty common in the field.
In that strange way, he was like Freud. He was leaving himself out. As I experienced him, I thought you were going to say his opening remark was going to be, "I feel very shy and awkward sitting here. I'm not sure I have anything that's going to fulfill your needs."
Yeah, that would have been
that would have been authentic about him.
Yeah. Yeah, the field pulls for people who tend to be a bit introverted, so it's not shocking that might have been his reality.
So I can't avoid doing it. How did I wind up having this conversation with you two guys when I look out at the great mass of my colleagues now, and they don't know what the fuck I'm talking about? they're clueless. They don't know how to talk to a client. They're often some other thing looking again for mechanically for what is it I'm supposed to be doing here and what specialized DBT training am I going to need to treat this diagnosis. They're often some land I don't even recognize. That's why I'm giving this eulogy. So thank you guys for existing. You somehow joined me in my life and I'm very comfortable with you. It sounds like you're comfortable with the kinds of things I talk about. And that's such a joy.
Well, I was going to say, you know, if someone had a mentor, the only professor who ever took interest in me was you.
Oh God, I felt really saddened by that because my retort to you was they probably didn't take any more interest in their clients than that either.
Yeah.
They were looking for the right protocol to follow with them rather than having any kind of human connection with them.
Probably.
And I felt that probably the most one, if not the most valuable course that I had in my entire CSPP career was professional roles,
Wow.
taught by
Love
yours
teaching
truly.
that course.
Huh?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to teach people how to be a psychologist because that's what the course says. It's about professional roles. What is the humanity of a psychologist?
Coming of age.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, guys. Thank you for listening.
Okay.
I will
All
do
right.
part 3 next time.
All right.
All right.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
guys.